April 17, 1943. A secure testing facility outside Stuttgart, Germany. The morning fog had barely lifted when a covered transport truck arrived at the Reich Ministry of Armaments research complex. Security was unusually tight, even by wartime standards. SS guards checked identification papers 3 times before allowing the vehicle through the main gate. Inside the compound, a group of Germany's most accomplished automotive engineers and military analysts had been summoned for an emergency assessment. They had been told only that an important piece of captured enemy equipment required immediate examination. No one had specified what that equipment was. Dr. Ferdinand Porsche, already renowned for his automotive designs and currently leading Germany's tank development programs, stood among the assembled engineers. Beside him was Dr. Fritz Toth's successor team, men responsible for evaluating enemy military technology and assessing its implications for German production capabilities. Also present were representatives from Daimler-Benz, from Opel, from the various manufacturers struggling to meet the Wehrmacht's insatiable demand for military vehicles. These were not junior technicians or casual observers. These were the men who understood German automotive engineering at its highest levels, who knew exactly what German industry could and could not produce, who comprehended the relationship between engineering sophistication and manufacturing capacity. The transport truck backed up to the testing facility's main bay. Guards removed the canvas covering, and a crane carefully lowered the cargo onto the concrete floor. What emerged was unremarkable in appearance, almost disappointingly mundane. It was an American military vehicle, boxy and utilitarian, painted in drab olive green. The vehicle showed signs of combat use, mud caked on the wheel wells, minor dents in the body panels, worn tires. It had been captured 3 weeks earlier in Tunisia, when a reconnaissance patrol overran an American position. German intelligence had flagged it as requiring immediate technical assessment, hence its transport to Stuttgart, rather than being stripped for parts in North Africa like most captured vehicles. The engineers approached slowly, circling the vehicle with professional skepticism. At first glance, it seemed crude, even primitive by German engineering standards. The body was simple stamped steel with minimal curves or aerodynamic considerations. The design appeared rushed, unsophisticated, the kind of vehicle a competent engineer might sketch in an afternoon. There was no elegance to its lines, no evidence of the meticulous design refinement that characterized German military vehicles. Several engineers exchanged glances that communicated shared disdain. American engineering, they seemed to say without words, always prioritized crude functionality over sophisticated design. Dr. Porsche ran his hand along the hood, feeling the metal's thickness and examining the welds. His expression began to change. The welds were crude but consistent, performed quickly but adequately. The steel was thinner than German military vehicles used, but not weak. It had been chosen deliberately for weight savings while maintaining sufficient structural integrity. He opened the hood and stared at the engine in silence for nearly a minute. The other engineers gathered around, peering at the American power plant. What they saw troubled them in ways they were only beginning to articulate. The engine was a simple 4-cylinder design, producing approximately 60 horsepower. By German standards, it was underpowered and unsophisticated. German military vehicles typically featured more powerful engines with greater performance capabilities. But this engine had something German engines increasingly lacked. It was designed for mass production with interchangeable parts, minimal machining requirements, and assembly processes that required limited skilled labor. Every component was standardized, every bolt was the same thread specification, every part could be produced by manufacturers with basic metalworking equipment. One of the Daimler-Benz engineers removed the oil dipstick and examined it. His hands began to tremble slightly. "The tolerances," he said quietly. "They are loose by our standards, but sufficient for function." This engine was designed to be built by the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. It sacrifices performance for manufacturability. Another engineer was examining the transmission, which used a similar design philosophy. Simple, robust, designed for rapid production rather than optimal performance. The vehicle's four-wheel drive system was mechanically straightforward, using components that could be manufactured with conventional equipment and assembled quickly. The transfer case was accessible and could be serviced with basic tools. Every aspect of the design prioritized ease of production and maintenance over engineering sophistication. Dr. Porsche moved methodically around the vehicle, his experienced eye cataloging details that told a larger story. The body panels were stamped from flat steel sheets with minimal compound curves, which meant they could be produced on simple presses without expensive dies or extensive tooling. The frame was welded rather than requiring complex casting or forging operations. The suspension was crude but effective, using leaf springs and simple shock absorbers that could be manufactured by suppliers with basic capabilities. The electrical system was simple, using standard commercial components rather than military specification parts that required specialized production. But it was when Porsche examined the dashboard that the full implications began crystallizing. The instrument cluster was minimal: speedometer, oil pressure gauge, ammeter, fuel gauge, temperature gauge. All were standard commercial items, identical to those used in civilian vehicles. The switches and controls were commercial grade. Even the steering wheel appeared to be a civilian design. This vehicle was not purpose-built for military use from the ground up. It was a design that leveraged existing civilian automotive supply chains and manufacturing capabilities. The engineers spent 3 hours conducting their initial assessment. They measured dimensions, photographed components, sketched assembly methods, analyzed materials. As they worked, a collective realization began forming, unwelcome and unavoidable. This simple, crude American vehicle represented something far more threatening than sophisticated German engineering faced in combat. It represented an entirely different philosophy of military production, one that Germany had no capability to match. The vehicle was a Willys MB, though the Germans did not yet know its official designation. Americans would come to call it the Jeep, a name that would become synonymous with American military mobility. But on that April morning in Stuttgart, the German engineers saw it first as a puzzle, then as a revelation, and finally as a harbinger of inevitable defeat. Dr. Porsche requested production records from the intelligence files that had accompanied the vehicle. What he read made his face pale. American production projections indicated that manufacturers were building these vehicles at rates exceeding 400 per day. The projections suggested total production could reach 600,000 or more by war's end. Porsche did the mathematics quickly in his head. Germany's entire military vehicle production, all trucks, all cars, all motorcycles, everything with wheels and an engine, totaled approximately 100,000 vehicles annually. The Americans were building more of this single vehicle type than Germany built of all vehicles combined. But raw production numbers, while staggering, were not what troubled Porsche most deeply. It was the design philosophy that production represented. The Jeep had been engineered specifically for mass production by an economy transitioning from civilian to military manufacturing. It used standard parts that existing suppliers could produce. It required no specialized military manufacturing infrastructure. It could be built in facilities that normally produced civilian automobiles with minimal conversion effort. Its maintenance could be performed by mechanics with basic automotive training rather than requiring specialized military technical expertise. Germany's military vehicles, by contrast, were sophisticated machines requiring skilled labor, specialized components, and complex manufacturing processes. The Kübelwagen, Germany's light military vehicle designed by Porsche himself, was an excellent machine, more sophisticated than the Jeep, better performance in many respects, a product of superior engineering. But it required specialized production that only Volkswagen's factory could perform at scale, using components that required skilled machinists and complex supply chains. Germany could produce perhaps 50,000 Kübelwagens annually at maximum capacity. The Americans would build 600,000 Jeeps. The assessment team prepared their report over the following week. They tested the captured Jeep extensively, driving it over various terrain, measuring its performance, analyzing its capabilities and limitations. The vehicle performed adequately in all tests, but exceptionally in none. Its top speed was modest, its ride quality was harsh, its engine was underpowered for the vehicle's weight. By every measure of engineering sophistication, it was inferior to comparable German vehicles. Yet the report's conclusion was devastating in its implications. The American light vehicle represents a fundamental approach to military production that Germany cannot match. While individually inferior to German equivalents in performance and engineering quality, the enemy's design philosophy enables production at scales that render quality comparisons strategically irrelevant. The vehicle is designed not for engineering excellence, but for overwhelming numerical superiority. It is intended to be everywhere, to be so numerous that losses are insignificant, to flood the battlefield with sufficient vehicles that performance limitations become meaningless. The report continued with calculations that made for grim reading. If American production projections are accurate, enemy forces will possess light vehicle quantities exceeding our entire military vehicle inventory before the end of 1944. This numerical advantage cannot be overcome through superior engineering or tactical employment. The enemy has chosen to win through arithmetic rather than artistry, and arithmetic always prevails in industrial warfare. The report was classified and distributed to senior Reich leadership, including Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer's own records, examined after the war, indicate he understood the implications immediately. Germany was fighting an industrial war with an opponent who had mastered industrial warfare at scales Germany could not approach. The Jeep was not an isolated example. It was representative of American production philosophy across all categories of military equipment. What made the Jeep particularly revealing was its ubiquity in American military organization. German intelligence, analyzing captured American documents and prisoner interrogations, discovered that the U.S. military planned to field these vehicles at ratios incomprehensible by German standards. American infantry divisions had organic transport that exceeded German motorized divisions. American supply units operated vehicle fleets larger than those available to entire German armies. The Jeep was not a specialized vehicle for specific units. It was a universal transport intended to motorize the entire American military structure from frontline combat units to rear area administration. The German automotive industry attempted to respond to these findings. There were proposals to simplify German vehicle designs, to adopt American mass production techniques, to sacrifice engineering sophistication for manufacturing speed. But these proposals confronted intractable realities. Germany's automotive industry was already operating at near maximum capacity. Retooling for new designs would reduce production in the short term. Simplifying designs required abandoning specialized components that German suppliers had invested years developing. The manufacturing infrastructure for mass production on American scales simply did not exist and could not be created while simultaneously maintaining current production. More fundamentally, Germany faced resource constraints that no amount of engineering ingenuity could overcome. The Jeep required steel, rubber, copper, aluminum, all materials that Germany was desperately short of by 1943. Even if German industry could match American production techniques, it lacked the raw materials to match American production volumes. The mathematics were brutally simple. America produced more steel in 1 month than Germany produced in a year. America's rubber synthesis and imports dwarfed German synthetic rubber production. American copper production exceeded German supply by factors of 10 or more. By late 1943, captured Jeeps were appearing across multiple fronts wherever American forces operated. In Italy, where American troops had landed in September, German forces encountered American units with mobility that seemed impossible by German logistical standards. American infantry units advanced with organic vehicle transport that allowed rapid repositioning. American artillery units moved with a speed that German forces, still heavily reliant on horse-drawn transport, could not match. American supply convoys operated vehicle fleets that delivered ammunition and supplies at rates German logistics officers considered wasteful, even obscene. German commanders began reporting a pattern that intelligence analysts found deeply troubling. When German forces destroyed American vehicles in combat, those vehicles were replaced within days or sometimes hours. American units that suffered heavy equipment losses in battle were fully re-equipped before German forces could exploit their tactical victories. The Americans seemed to view vehicles as disposable, not because they were careless, but because they had so many that individual losses were tactically insignificant. One German panzer commander in Italy filed a report that captured the psychological impact of facing such material abundance. "We destroyed an American convoy yesterday, approximately 40 vehicles, including their light reconnaissance cars, jeeps. Today, we observed the same American unit operating with what appeared to be a complete replacement of lost vehicles. They suffer losses we cannot absorb and replace them as if nothing happened. We are fighting an enemy who can afford to be wasteful because their production makes waste irrelevant." The strategic implications extended beyond ground vehicles. The Jeep represented a philosophy of military logistics that pervaded every aspect of American military organization. American forces operated on the assumption that supplies were abundant, that equipment could be replaced rapidly, that mobility was universal rather than limited to specialized units. This assumption shaped tactics, operational planning, and strategic objectives in ways that gave American forces inherent advantages no amount of German tactical skill could overcome. German military planners conducted studies comparing logistics capabilities that produced depressing conclusions. A single American infantry division had more organic transport than a German panzer division. An American corps could move and supply itself at speeds German armies could not match. The American supply chain from factory to front line delivered equipment and materials at rates that exceeded German consumption, even if Germany had no supply constraints whatsoever. The psychological impact on German engineers and military planners who understood these realities was profound. They were confronting the mathematical certainty of defeat, not defeat because German soldiers were less brave, or German tactics were inferior, or German weapons were inadequate. Defeat because Germany was fighting an industrial war against an opponent with 10 times the industrial capacity, and no amount of engineering excellence or tactical brilliance could overcome such fundamental disparity. Dr. Porsche himself reached this conclusion by mid-1943, though he could not state it publicly. His post-war interviews revealed that examining the captured Jeep was a pivotal moment in his understanding of the war's trajectory. He had believed German engineering superiority would provide competitive advantage even against numerically superior opponents. The Jeep demonstrated that American engineers had solved a different problem, not how to build the best vehicle, but how to build adequate vehicles in overwhelming numbers. They had chosen quantity over quality deliberately, understanding that industrial warfare rewarded production volume more than engineering sophistication. The irony was bitter for German engineers who had spent careers pursuing technical excellence. They had created vehicles that were masterpieces of automotive engineering, sophisticated, capable, products of meticulous design and skilled craftsmanship. And they were losing to crude, simple vehicles designed for mass production by semi-skilled workers using conventional manufacturing equipment. It was a repudiation of everything German engineering culture valued, and it was undeniably effective. By 1944, the Jeep had become ubiquitous across every theater where American forces operated. Over 640,000 were ultimately produced during the war, making it one of the most numerous military vehicles in history. They served in Europe, in the Pacific, in North Africa, in Asia. They were supplied to Allied forces through Lend-Lease, with tens of thousands going to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations. The Jeep became symbolic of American military power, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was everywhere. German forces facing American advance in 1944 and 1945 encountered tactics enabled by this universal motorization. American units could concentrate forces rapidly, could shift defensive positions before German attacks developed, could pursue defeated German formations faster than horse-drawn German logistics could retreat. The mobility advantage was not marginal, it was categorical, a fundamental difference in how American and German forces could operate. After the war, when Allied investigators examined German military records and interviewed surviving military leaders, they found repeated references to the psychological impact of facing such overwhelming material superiority. German soldiers and officers described feeling not just outnumbered but industrially obsolete, fighting with excellent equipment that existed in inadequate quantities against adequate equipment that existed in overwhelming abundance. But the story of the Jeep's discovery was not merely about production statistics and engineering philosophy. It was about the human beings who grasped the implications and understood what that knowledge meant. Dr. Porsche and the engineers who examined that captured vehicle in April 1943 were not monsters or fanatics. They were professionals who had devoted their lives to automotive engineering, who took pride in their work, who understood their craft at the highest levels. They were also Germans in 1943, living in a totalitarian state, fighting a war of aggression that was already killing millions. What does it mean to realize your nation has already lost a war that will continue for 2 more years? What is it like to understand that millions more will die in fighting that cannot change the ultimate outcome? To know that cities will be destroyed, families shattered, a generation sacrificed, all for a defeat that mathematics has already determined? To possess this knowledge and be unable to act on it, unable to stop what is coming, unable to even speak the truth publicly without risking execution for defeatism? The engineers who examined the Jeep carried this burden silently. They prepared their reports, conducted their assessments, continued their work because they had no choice. Some, like Porsche, survived the war and spoke later about what they had understood. Others died in the final chaotic months of Germany's collapse, taking their knowledge with them. None could stop what was coming. The Jeep itself, crude and simple and mass-produced, outlasted them all. After the war, surplus Jeeps became civilian vehicles across the world. They were used by farmers, by rural communities, by developing nations. They were so numerous that they became cheap and accessible, democratic in a way German engineering never imagined. The vehicle designed for overwhelming production abundance became a tool of post-war reconstruction and development. The factory where that captured Jeep was examined in April 1943 was destroyed by Allied bombing in 1944. The reports the engineers prepared were captured by advancing American forces in 1945. Dr. Porsche was arrested by Allied authorities after the war, imprisoned briefly, then released to continue his engineering career. He never designed another military vehicle. He focused instead on sports cars, creating machines that embodied the engineering excellence he had always valued. Perhaps that was his way of reclaiming what the war had taken, the belief that engineering excellence mattered for its own sake, not as a weapon in industrial mathematics he could never win. On a spring morning in 1943, German engineers looked at a simple American vehicle and saw their future. They saw defeat not written in battlefield tactics or strategic errors, but in production capacity and design philosophy. They saw arithmetic made manifest in stamped steel and simple engineering. They understood in that moment what most Germans would not grasp for 2 more years. The war was already lost, not on battlefields but in factories, not through fighting but through mathematics. The Jeep sat in that testing facility, mud still caked on its tires from Tunisian roads, mechanical testimony to an industrial reality that would grind Germany into surrender. It was ugly and crude and unsophisticated. It was also unstoppable because it was one of hundreds of thousands, because behind it stood American factories that could build more faster than German forces could destroy them, because it represented an industrial philosophy that valued sufficiency at scale over excellence in isolation. The engineers who examined it understood all this. They wrote their reports. They returned to their work. They carried the knowledge of inevitable defeat through 2 more years of war, through millions more deaths, through the destruction of their cities and the collapse of their nation. They understood the truth, but could not speak it, could not act on it, could not stop the machinery of war that ground forward despite mathematical certainty of failure. That simple vehicle, designed for mass production by an economy that understood industrial warfare better than any nation in history, outlasted the regime that examined it, outlasted the engineers who understood its implications, outlasted the war itself. It became a symbol of American power, of democratic industrial capacity, of what happens when a society mobilizes its full economic resources for war. But in that moment in April 1943, in a testing facility outside Stuttgart, it was something else entirely. It was a prophet of ruin, a mechanical oracle, a simple stamped steel harbinger of everything that was coming. The engineers who saw it first understood this immediately and completely. They touched its crude welds and simple components and understood they were touching their own defeat, made visible and undeniable. The Jeep is long gone now, perhaps scrapped, perhaps sitting in some museum unaware of its significance. The engineers are gone too, their knowledge buried with them. But the truth they understood remains, preserved in classified reports and post-war testimonies. On April 17, 1943, Germany's finest automotive engineers examined a captured American Jeep and realized they had already lost the war. Not on battlefields, but in factories. Not through fighting, but through arithmetic. Not in the future, but in that very moment, staring at crude American engineering that would bury them in its abundance. They saw the future, and it was olive green, mass-produced, and absolutely unstoppable. And there was nothing they could do but watch it come.